Welcome to Tech Talk Tuesday, brought to you by Idaho Public Television and Montana PBS.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday. I'm Nikki Vredenberg, and joining me is Carrie Wardle from Idaho Public Television. Carrie and I are coming together this month to talk about trauma-informed teaching resources. And we're lucky because Carrie has done extensive research in this area, and I'm excited for her to teach us what she knows today. So Carrie, for those of us who are feeling a little bit new or possibly overwhelmed by this topic of trauma-informed instruction, what are the basics? What do we need to know as teachers when it comes to supporting students who have experienced trauma?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I should say that I've done significant research because as a teacher myself, I did not learn about trauma-informed training or anything, but I started doing foster care and had to take a certain number of hours of training where I learned about trauma-informed practices. And then I was amazed when I started learning about that and really thought, oh my gosh, why aren't teachers being taught this? Because it really did sort of give me a new lens by which to view my students. And so we'll just talk a little bit about, trauma-informed teaching and what that means. And so Nikki, do you want to go to that next slide for me? So let's talk about stress versus trauma, because sometimes I think it's a little bit confusing. Stress is typically just a typical reaction to life events. It's not always harmful. Sometimes we're just stressed out because we have a deadline or a project coming up, right? That doesn't necessarily cause harm. And then stress can also just be anything that sort of upsets us. Trauma is typically an event or an experience that does almost always cause harm. And really the fascinating, and I'm not going to go into all of it because I don't know if everybody finds it as fascinating as I do, but brain research on this, they've actually seen kids' brains who suffer from trauma, and there are actual holes in the brain. Like it actually does create places where the neural pathways do not connect. And so kind of a little bit of a distinction there. Now, obviously, sometimes stress can cause traumatic events, right, in our lives, but not everything that is stressful is always traumatic. And so one of the things, if you'll go to the next slide, Nikki, that I think that was, for me, I think the most like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this, was a thing called ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And you can see that there was a study done from 95 to 97 with Kaiser Permanente. They studied people. They didn't actually mean to study trauma. What they actually were studying was some underlying health conditions. And they were studying things like cardiac health. And what they started to notice was that a high percentage, in fact, a really like mind-blowingly high percentage to them, and I don't want to quote it because I don't know it, but of people that were having cardiac health issues had also had some sort of significant trauma in their childhood. And so they began to study that, and they began to think, holy cow, maybe trauma is affecting physical health. So this sort of study happened just sort of accidentally because they were trying to figure out if they could get to the bottom of sort of underlying cardiac issues. And so then they went on to study about 17,000 people who had suffered from 10 different areas of trauma, which came to be referred to as adverse childhood experiences. And you can see on this slide, those include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, either of a parent even, domestic violence, substance abuse, and incarceration. There have since been a few more things added to that, but those are the basic 10 that what they found was that there is a pretty significant relationship between a child's ACE score and their physical reduced health later in life. In fact, so there's 10, and so there's a quiz you can take. It's linked in this slide deck. The higher your ACE score, the more physical, the more it is connected to physical impairments. And what they found is that people that had 4 times, an ACE score of 4 or higher were lived 20 years shorter than the average person, and had higher rates of, you can see this in the first bullet there under that last bullet, the first sub bullet, higher rates of smoking, substance abuse, obesity has been tied to that, depression, suicide attempts, all of those things listed there. And the higher up that score goes, the higher those all increase. Like you have a bigger percentage of suffering from heart disease. If you have 8 or 9 ACEs, then it's even higher. And so that's not even talking about the emotional trauma and stress. I just feel like that kind of stuff is so mind-blowing that they sort of Kaiser Permanente sort of stumbled on that, on the connection between physical health and ACEs. And the reason that it's when you're a child, so keep in mind that these are when they're a child, is because that's when all of those, and we know that, right? We know that from birth to age 5, but even a little bit up to age 8, but that's when all of those neural pathways are forming in a child's brain. And so those traumatic experiences happening at that young age really do have a huge effect on them. And even babies, you know, sometimes we think, well, they're not going to be old enough to remember it. But brain research is showing that they are, because those neural pathways don't form, or they form incorrectly. So what I love about this is that's the physical, it doesn't talk about the emotional. So do you want to go to the next slide, Nikki? These are the statistics that I think are a little bit staggering to me. And this is the moment when I heard these and went, oh my gosh. So the chart on the right-hand side is specific to Idaho, because that's where I'm from. Idaho, and then on the left is national statistics. Idaho is the 5th highest in the country for children that have 3 or more ACEs. And so that I thought was a pretty staggering number. And then the most prevalent ACE, so they asked adults, there was a survey that asked adults, what's the, you know, the thing that you suffered from the most? And largely in Idaho, emotional abuse. About 37% of adults said that, excuse me, that were surveyed said that they had suffered from emotional abuse. On a national level, 1 in 6 adults have experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. And we look at 4 or more because 4 is that kind of magic number. All of them affect you, but 4 is that number where now you live 20 years, you can live 20 years longer, and you start having all those other health problems. 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death are also associated with ACEs. And I thought that was yet another just staggering statistic. And these come from the link is at the bottom. And then the other one that I thought was just so mind-blowing as well is that preventing ACEs, so stopping kids from having those adverse childhood experiences, would reduce the number of adults with depression by 44%. So when you start thinking of all of those things adding up, I just think it's such a big thing for us to know about. There's a link at the bottom of this page that's to the CDC. The CDC has a really great infographic where I took some of this data from, but if you're interested in looking that up, they also have some really great information on what you can do to prevent ACEs and just some of the data as well. I think, so what that means for a teacher, the other sort of thing that we're learning, so sometimes kids that have behavior problems, you know that kid, right? The one who's naughty and you don't know what to do with them and you're really struggling. It's likely that they are or have suffered some form of ACEs. And the other sort of amazing thing to me, will you go back a slide, Nikki? I had highlighted on that one slide that what they've also found is that even, see the highlighted part, positive, caring, safe relationships can help mitigate the effects. A child being able to have a bond with even one grown-up can significantly reduce the trauma, the effects on the brain, and can significantly help to sort of rewire. And what I love about that is that, you know, you always hear the kind of cliche, like one person can make a difference. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I roll my eyes and I'm like, really? No. But really, it is true, right? Like the studies are showing that even just one person that is a positive, caring, and safe relationship for a child can help to mitigate the effects of adverse childhood experiences. And so what that meant for me as a teacher was I could be that one person to that child who, you know, maybe their home life is not great and maybe they are suffering from some of those adverse childhood experiences, but I can be the safe place for that kid and really be that person that helps to mitigate that. And so later in the month, excuse me, we're going to bring in some teachers and we're going to talk specifically about things that you can do in your classroom to help this kind of kid. But we really just wanted to give that background. I wanted to share some of those statistics. I will also tell you that I've read some recent studies. I'm a nerd. I read studies. Who does that? Me, because I'm a nerd. That there is some connection between that often effects of trauma look like the symptoms of ADHD. And so that a lot of kids who we are diagnosing with ADHD do not actually have ADHD, but they have suffered an adverse childhood experience. They have had some sort of trauma, and that we really need to figure out what the trauma is and try to heal that first, because a lot of those same things, the inability to focus and that, you know, that we target as a kid who can't sit still and those kinds of things are also side effects of coming from trauma. So I think as a classroom teacher, just being mindful of the fact that probably a fourth or more of your class have suffered about 4 or more ACEs, right? That's kind of the statistic that we're getting, 1 in 4. So, and I would be willing to bet that I don't know the percentage, but a pretty high percentage of your students have suffered at least one. Because if you saw on there, divorce is one of them. And, you know, divorce is really prevalent. So I think just being mindful of that and coming at it, and again, we'll talk about things that we can do to help students later, but coming at it from a place of, you know, what is the reason behind the behavior? Kids they don't typically misbehave just because they want to misbehave. In fact, in general, kids really want to please grown-ups, especially if they, you know, love you, but they may have suffered some significant amount of trauma. And if you can just figure out a way to connect with them, then I think it can make all the difference. And when I started looking at things through that lens, when I started looking in my classroom through the lens of I can be the one person that could help mitigate the effects of trauma for this student, it really sort of just broadened my perspective. And then of course, the more relationships that those kids can form, the more safe relationships that we can form for them, we can even help them to have an even greater effect, right? So really bringing the school counselor in and really figuring out ways to give those kids safe spaces so that we can help to, you know, mitigate some of the childhood experiences. I think it's important to note also that there have been recent studies on the fact that COVID, excuse me, has also exacerbated some of this trauma. And so we're coming back into you know, teachers are all coming back into the classroom with kids who have suffered some pretty severe trauma, and it is just isolation, but it also may be that they were home with parents who were substance abusers or who were abusive to them, and they didn't have a safe place to go for a year because maybe school was their safe place. And so the CDC has a great, I think it's CDC website, if you search for that, but also there's links here, is a great resource for this. They have some statistics and some studies on the trauma and the effects of COVID-19 with kids. And so again, just really figuring out and being mindful of the fact that now you're all going back into the classroom with kids who already the statistics were pretty high, with 1 in 4 having suffered, and this was all before COVID. Now you're probably coming back into a classroom where I would say the majority of kids during COVID suffered some sort of trauma, and it may have been a death of a family member, which is not on the list of the 10, but has been added to the list that the CDC has of another thing that could cause that's an adverse childhood experience. So the death of a parent or family member. So I just think it's so important that if there's some great books, there's a lot of research on the internet that you can look to learn about trauma and being trauma informed. And I think it's critical at this point in teaching that that we're informed, because there's a good number of kids in your class, I can promise you, that have suffered some sort of trauma, and knowing how to handle that and how to help them could make all of the difference for that child down the road.
Thanks, Carrie. That was really informative, and it helped me with just to see the power of getting to know our students and learning everything that we can learn, and having really strong connections to their caregivers. And doesn't all get done overnight, but we're at that beginning of the year part where we're still learning about all these things, and gathering as much information and really approaching our students with as much empathy as possible is key in this.
Yep.
Well, thank you for joining us for Tech Talk Tuesday. This week was about laying that foundation for the understanding of traumatic experiences and how they impact students. And in weeks ahead in this month, we'll unpack some more resources and strategies from classrooms. And just stay tuned for more.